Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Artifact number 6. In today's exploration, we are going to look at some of the architectural and sculptural developments in New Kingdom Egypt. In our previous artifact, I mentioned to you that the geographical focus of Old Kingdom Egypt was primarily in the north, in Lower Egypt, which is why we looked at some of the burial structures in places like Giza, Saqqara, and even a little bit in Dashur. But today we're going to go upriver on the Nile and look at some of the places to the south. We'll look at we'll look at some of the developments in Karnak and Hyrcanopolis, but we'll eventually get back a little bit to the north as well. And so it's important just to remember that one of the major differences between Old Kingdom Egypt and New Kingdom Egypt is that we're slightly shifting geography for a while. Another shift that we'll see, and the importance of this shift cannot be overstated, is the ways in which Egypt is going through profound social and religious upheaval during this time. It really is a colossal shift, and the changes we are still dealing with, dealing with isn't the right phrase, we're still a part of in our world some, 4,000 years later. So I want to begin today by looking at this object here. This is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. It's from Dai el Bahari, and that again is in Upper Egypt to the south. And this structure dates from around 1500 BCE. So to frame it for you in terms of Old Kingdom Egypt, there's about 1,000 years between the pyramids at Giza and the construction of this monument right here. We've gone from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom. Now, to be perfectly honest, there is a Middle Kingdom, but it's largely a period of remarkable upheaval and foreign invasion into Egypt, and I just don't find it really that interesting. And so we're going to jump right to the New Kingdom, and I want to talk a little bit about this structure and its function. This is a mortuary temple, and a mortuary temple is different than burial structure. A mortuary temple is a construction that we use to remember the person rather than bury the person. And I'll explain it to you this way. If you've been to Washington, D.C., you no doubt have seen the Washington Memorial. It's right in the middle of the mall. It's that gigantic Egyptian obelisk that is in the middle of the mall in Washington, D.C. That is not where Washington is buried. President Washington is buried at his family estate in Mount Vernon, maybe 15 miles away. He's not buried at the Washington Memorial. So that's not his burial structure in DC. It is merely where we go to remember him. And that is exactly what this structure is here. Hatshepsut was not buried here. This is where we remember them. And from a formal point of view, this is a fascinating object. We have a series of ramps and these temple-like colonnades that lead us from one platform to another. And interestingly, you have these vertical lines from these columns all along here, and they sort of mimic the columns of the striations in the rock background, which I find quite lovely. This object was largely cut from rock, so we can think of it as being carved as much as being built, and that provides it another level of interest to us. I wanted to provide you with a statue of Hatshepsut, and there are not many that survive for reasons that I'll make clear in but a moment. But this is a statue, and Hatshepsut is kneeling, and in both hands is holding offering jars. You can imagine like palm oil or wine being placed in these. And Hatshepsut is wearing the traditional attires of an Egyptian pharaoh, the linen kilt, the headdress, the false beard, and even right here, you'll see there's something coming out of that, off of the headdress. It's either a vulture or a cobra. I forget which one it is now. Both are symbols for Egypt, one for Upper Egypt and the other for Lower Egypt. And what's interesting about this is Hatshepsut's gender. Now, I'm usually pretty careful about these things, and I can't guarantee it, but I would imagine that so far in the discussion of Hatshepsut, I have not mentioned her gender. Hatshepsut was not a man. Hatshepsut was a woman. And yet, despite all of this, due to her own political skill, some unfortunate events involving her son and husband, she became Pharaoh. And the word Pharaoh itself, as an Egyptian, is inherently gendered. Pharaoh essentially means male ruler. And 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 this is an interesting phrase. For example, it's different from language to language. So right now in Great Britain, we have the Queen of England, and she is in whatever ways the Queen is the ruler of the English people, and she's not. She's just a rich lady with a nice crown. But that's her name, and Queen Elizabeth, and her husband is not King Philip, it's Prince Philip. Okay, soon when Elizabeth kicks the bucket, her son, Prince Charles, will become King Charles, and his wife, and it's complicated. I don't know that she will, but I think her name is Camilla. But let's just go with Lady Di because my mother really liked her. If Charles were still married to Princess Diana would then become Queen Diana. So if we think about this from a semiotical point of view in English, currently there's Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip, and whenever she dies, King Charles and Queen Diana. And this is important for the following fact. In the English language, the word king very specifically means male ruler. And that is why Prince Philip is not called King Philip, because king means ruler and he is not. In the word English language, the word queen does not have the mandatory designation of ruler, which is right now Queen Elizabeth is the ruler. But if Princess Diana were still alive when King Charles becomes King Charles, she would be Queen Diana, but not a ruler. I hope that's clear. In the Egyptian language, the word pharaoh is a gendered noun and means ruler. So it would be sort of like, well, in English, we have many nouns that have a female designator, right? So an actor and actress, and the same is true in French, right? In French, there are gendered nouns. If I'm speaking to an actor, it could be a man or woman, I suppose, because we often, like Meryl Streep calls herself an actor. But if we're speaking of the word actress, it very specifically means one who is a woman. The word pharaoh in Egyptian means male ruler, and she was not. But she began to be one. She began to dress like a man, and the representations of her that survive show her in the guise of a pharaoh with a false beard, although she could not have grown her own, a pharaoh wearing a headdress, a pharaoh wearing a skirt, a pharaoh not having an uncovered upper body. So due to political machinations, she becomes the pharaoh, and she is, I think, the first leader in the West that was a woman, whose name we know, I should say. So unfortunately, as time goes on and she is replaced because she is a woman, I believe she's murdered in time, many statues of her were demolished. Her name was erased from the historical record. But there are some that survive, and this is as a sphinx. Again, with a false beard, because that beard is not just a designator of gender, but also of being a ruler. Where was Hatshepsut buried? I don't know. And the reason why I don't know is I don't think that we do know. This was where we remember her, and she was buried somewhere else. And the reason why she was buried somewhere else is that in the New Kingdom, there became an increased interest in having burial structures not destroyed, ransacked, pillaged, and looted. And so if we've ever found her burial structure, we don't know where it is anymore, but it likely was never found. Or if it was found in antiquity, and we don't know where that is anymore. Now, there are many New Kingdom pharaohs that have mortuary temples, and this one is from Abu Simbel, again in the south in Upper Egypt, not a burial structure, mortuary temple. And this was made for Ramses II to give you an idea. Here's a local neighborhood scale figure so you get an idea of the scale of this object. It's these statues are enormous, and this has been carved out of the mountainside. One of the things that's really interesting about the Egyptians, and actually many ancient cultures, was how important the the stars and the nighttime sky was to them. And depending upon where you live, and I live in Ruston, Louisiana now, which is not a big place, and there's not a lot of light pollution, which means at night I can see stars. But I grew up in Arizona, in Tucson, where there was a lot of nighttime light, and so completely washed out like nighttime sky, and lived in DC, where you saw no stars. But imagine going somewhere where there's no lights at night. Imagine the nighttime sky. I mean, it's brilliant. And, if you live in a rural place, you might have that kind of experience. So because there is no light pollution, the Egyptians were keenly aware of the movement of the stars, the movement of the planets, and the rising and setting of the sun. And this served a kind of calendrical function. On June 21st, what we call June 21st, the longest day of the year, the sun rose, shone directly through this doorway, through the hallway, and down into this holy shrine. Right? So in many ways, this served a kind of calendrical function too. And Ramses was an important ruler for a lot of ways, but one of them was the number of children he had. He was amongst the most fertile rulers in the history of the world, and had some 100 kids, many of whom were buried and had burial structures in a place called the Valley of the King. And I'll show you a map of that in just a little while. One of the things we begin to see during the New Kingdom were so-called books of the dead. Now, a book of the dead is a kind of text that the Egyptians used as a way of providing their departed a kind of instruction manual, as a way of working their way through the afterlife. And this is a really good example of it. It dates from around the year 1300 BCE. And the main character of the Book of the Dead is our dead person. His name is Hennefer. And so this is made out of papyrus. And again, papyrus is a plant that grows along the banks of the Nile. And from papyrus, the Egyptians made what you and I would call a kind of paper. I mean, paper is essentially made of cotton. Good paper is made out of cotton. And this is made from papyrus. Let me show you some of the details of this. In the left-hand side of this, we can see that Hennefer is having his hand held by Anubis. Anubis is the god of the afterlife. And you can see here, Anubis is carrying what's called an ankh. It is an Egyptian symbol for life. In the middle section here, Anubis is in front of a scale, and he sits with Ammit. Ammit is the scariest thing you're going to see today. It's got the head of a crocodile, the mane of a lion, the upper body of what looks to be a giraffe, and the back end of a hippopotamus. Let me tell you, if you saw this thing walking down the street, you would go the other way. And Anubis is working on his scale. Over here, on this side of the scale, is a canoptic jar. A canoptic jar is a small clay jar that holds one of four organs that the Egyptians believed was most valuable. In this instance, in this kind of canoptic jar sits a heart. And he's measuring that heart over here with a feather. So he's measuring Hennefer's heart against that of a feather. And if his heart weighs less than a feather, he's deemed worthy of a blessed afterlife, and he goes on. If his heart weighs more than a feather, then Amit is going to eat him. That's not good for Hennefer. And next to them, you can see Thoth. Thoth is the ibis-headed god. And you can see in one hand, he's holding a piece of papyrus. In the other hand, he's holding a stylus and he's writing things down. Thankfully for Hennefer, he is thought to be worthy. And so here he stands again. Again, you can see him here and also on the left-hand side. So he shows up twice. And he's being presented by Horus to Osiris, the god of the underworld. And he holds both the crook, the crook of peace. It's called a shepherd's crook. Shepherds, like, I don't know if shepherding is a verb. It must be. Shepherds shepherd lambs, sheep. Sheep are peaceful. So it's a symbol of peacefulness. And over here, that's a flail. A flail is a kind of whip. So he holds peace, symbols of both peacefulness and violence. Clearly, he is thought worthy. And here we have some attendance for Osiris. So this object speaks to Hennefer's movement and judgment, right? He's judged worthy. And I want to show you something interesting. It's from, 2,000 years later, and we'll come back to this in due time. But up here, I give you a tympanum from a church in Saint-Lazare in France. And a tympanum is a sculptural element above a gigantic doorway. And in it, we have a Last Judgment scene. And we'll look at this in our next module. But for the time being, how about this? We have a gigantic image of Christ. And over here on the side here, we have the same scene happening. We have a scale. You can sort of see it's been damaged a little bit, but there's one side of the scale. There's the other side of the scale. And here are the baskets. On this end, we have an angel who's holding up the basket, trying to lift it up. And over here, we have a ghoulish, devilish beastie trying to drag it down. This weighing of the soul, which we think of as being kind of a uniquely Christian element, goes all the way back to the Egyptian time frame. Now, I don't mean to suggest to you that Gezobertus, the artist who carved this, knew about this Book of the Dead. Of course he didn't. He never would have seen this. But it speaks to the ways in which this element was culturally common across millennia and continents. Now, one of the most important developments during the New Kingdom period was that of the Amarna period. And the Amarna period has a short run. It's not even 20 years, but the person who begins this is this guy here. His name is Akhenaten. And it would be difficult to overstate his importance within our own world today. And as a way to talk about this, we need to speak about these changes. Originally, Akhenaten was Amenhotep IV. And Amenhotep IV completely changed the entire religious structure of Egypt from a polytheistic, many gods structure to one that was monotheistic, only one God. I mean, interestingly, his name, Amenhotep, quite literally meant Hotep is like a word root that means servant to or servant of. and Amun was the name of a god. So he was the servant to Amun, which was one of many gods. Um, I just showed you three of them, right? You just saw Thoth, Anubis, Horus, and Osiris. Um, Akhenaten changed all of that structure from having Osiris and Ibis and all of them to one god. That god was named Aton. It meant one God or true God. And in doing so, in changing the religious structure, he also moved the capital of the Egyptian world from Thebes to a city he named after himself, Akhenaten, further upriver on the Nile. So you might be thinking, well, whoop-de-doo, he got rid of all the gods. Imagine, imagine someone came through today and said, imagine you're part of the Christian faith tradition, right? Imagine someone said, I realize your whole life that you have believed a certain set of doctrine, and you don't just know them, you believe them. If I were to ask you, is Jesus Christ the Son of God? You'd say, well, of course he is. And I'd say, well, why do you know that? You're like, I just know that. But like, really, you know that on the basis of a book that's 200 years old and written decades, if not a century after the life of Christ, but and still you know that? You're like, that's what I believe. And there's no way for me really to argue against that. I could say, well, the Bible is filled with contradictions as it pertains to the life of Christ. And you're like, that's what I believe. Say whatever you want. That's what I believe. Now imagine this guy comes through, and I'm picking on Pope Benedict because I can. Imagine Pope Benedict came through and said, listen, listen, listen. I know that you believe that Christ is the Son of God, and that we should hold Mary in a special place in our hearts because she was born without original sin and all of those things. And I'm speaking from my own Catholic tradition now, and your beliefs might be slightly different. But imagine if he were to come through and say, Jesus was good, and I'm good with Jesus, but I am the new true God. It's me. All the other gods are unneeded. And not only that, their servants, in this instance, we'll call them priests, are unneeded too. Can you imagine this? Because in every major place, guess what? There's a temple for Osiris, and there is a priest or priests and attendants who work there. The same for all of the Egyptian gods. And imagine this guy right here comes through and says, don't need those anymore. Hey, priests, you're fired. Can you imagine what happened? What would happen with that? Can you imagine the upheaval if now all of these people, like, first of all the Egyptians who have been told this thing their whole life are told that's no longer true. Um, and not only that, that all of the people who work for those groups, who now are without job, that they're fired as well. This threw Egypt into the most crazy upheaval that you can ever imagine. I mean, Akhenaten completely changed the religious structure, and in doing so, completely changed the ways in which pharaohs were shown. I mean, I give you this statue of him that dates from around 1350, right in the middle of that Amarna period. And I mean, and it's huge, it's 13 feet tall. And think about how he's been shown. Now, to be fair, there are some things there that we understand, right? He has his false beard, he has his headdress of sorts, he's wearing his linen kilt. But imagine the way in which his body has been shown. This looks remarkably different from the image of Khafre that we became accustomed to seeing. When we looked at Khafre's statue, I mentioned to you that this was an idealized version of our Egyptian pharaoh, right? This isn't likely what he looked like. This is how maybe we wish he would have looked like, but because he was a pharaoh, he had the right, it seemed, to be shown in a very specific kind of way. And now this person has been shown as if they are in the early part of their second trimester of pregnancy. They have these thin arms, these child-rearing hips, this swollen belly, um, and this super elongated face. And there are a couple of factors here at play, and either of them work, and and they could work together. And as a way to get there, let's start with image number one. This was and the image of Khafre. This was the traditional depiction of an Egyptian pharaoh. They were shown nude to the waist, wearing a linen kilt, and with a well-developed musculature in their upper body. Because they're not just a human, they're a god on earth. This is what the pharaohs look like. And this pharaoh, Khafre, was the pharaoh of a polytheistic civilization. And Akhenaten comes around, 1,200 years later and says, okay, it's a brand new day. Brand new day. What was once polytheistic is now monotheistic. And although this was the way in which pharaohs have been shown as a way to represent this brand new day in Egyptian religious life, this is the brand new day in the depiction of political and religious leadership in Egyptian life. So that's one explanation, as a way of distancing himself from the religious ways of Khafre. Akhenaten decided for a completely different representation of leadership. Do I think that explains things? Absolutely, I do. We'll see Christian architects do something very similar as a way of distancing themselves from the Roman religious tradition in architecture. But there's something else at play here, and we haven't touched upon this yet, but it's time to do so now. And that is the ways in which the family tree in Egyptian life doesn't have enough branches on it. Imagine you are the pharaoh and you believe that you are kind of a god on earth. That means your dad is the pharaoh. Your dad as the pharaoh is a god. So you clearly are a god. Do you want to taint your children with what's the word in Harry Potter? With a mud blood. I think that's right. Like someone who's not pure, or maybe just a muggle. I don't know. I'm not a Harry Potter scholar. And the answer was no. The Egyptians didn't want to do this. So if you want to keep your blood true, so to speak, and you're a god, who do you marry? Well, you marry someone you're related to. And that relatedness was sometimes and often your sister. Now, clearly, we live in a very different world that views this as being socially unacceptable. But it was remarkably common in all parts of the ancient world, and actually in many parts of the world in a much more frequent time frame. And I'll give you a good example of this. Um, you might have heard of a man named Rasputin. Rasputin is sometimes called the Mad Russian Monk. And in the early part of the 20th century, when the Russian world was still ruled by the Tsar, Rasputin became a remarkably important person to the Tsarina, and that's the Tsar's wife. And the reason for this is that the Tsar allegedly was able to cure, but couldn't actually, the little Tsar to be, and I think his name was Nicholas, of hemophilia. So let's talk about this. Hemophilia. Hemophilia is a genetically transmitted blood disorder, and those who suffer from it do not have an enzyme in their blood to generate platelets. Platelets is the substance in your blood that allows blood to clot. So if you cut yourself, your platelets, when activated, clot up that blood and prevent you from bleeding out. People without those, they are subjected to bruising, that will never actually be able to heal. And so hemophilia, prior to the middle part of the 20th century, when factor VIII was developed, which is a synthetic platelet, hemophilics usually didn't live very long because, if you broke a bone, you would never stop bleeding. And people broke bones all the time. I've broken two of them, right? You might have broken a bone. Imagine, you cut yourself chopping up onions for a salad. It would be a life-threatening thing. And so Rasputin was called in because they thought he could cure this. Well, why did the little czar in Russia have hemophilia? Because of the ways in which, due to genetic inbreeding and cousins marrying one another, that most of the royal families in all of Europe had become inbred. So I'll tell you something, and you might not know, this is kind of a fun fact. The name of the British royal family right now is Windsor, the House of Windsor. The House of Windsor is unbroken since, um, oh gosh, I think 1819. But the House of Windsor changed their name, I think, in 1915. And the reason why they did is the House of Windsor was once the House of Hanover. And that might not seem like a big deal, except Hanover is a German name. And in World War II, the British people were at war with, or World War One and two for that matter, but in World War One, the British monarchy and country was at war with Germany. And so they changed their name. But the British monarchy, as it stands right now, is German. King George, who is the king during the American Revolutionary War, had a son, George IV. George IV died without legitimate heir. He was also a little bit shackwacky, but he died. And so the next leader of succession was Queen Victoria. She was German, did not speak English when she came over to Great Britain. And so the German family, the English family, and the Russian family are all related to one another. And because of this, there is hemophilia that they carry in their genetic makeup. And if you have a cousin who doesn't have hemophilia but carries the gene, who marries another cousin who doesn't have hemophilia but carries the gene, there's a much greater chance that their offspring will have that. And that's what happened. So all of that is like a 6-minute digression to suggest to you that what had happened for millennia with the Egyptian pharaohs is that they had married their sisters, or on the best of days, their cousins. And what happens genetically over the course of generations? Well, disorders that are usually bred out because they're recessive and not fully expressed find a way to express themselves genetically. So one of the things that art historians and genetic historians believe is that by the New Kingdom, these pharaohs and their wives were suffering from a variety of genetic disorders that made their skeletons remarkably weak and somewhat disfigured. And what we might be looking at is representations of those disfigurements. Somewhere in my train wreck of an office right now, I have a National Geographic from maybe 2011 or 12, where they chronicle, because they have King Tut's body, they chronicle the genetic disorders that these people have and who they married and who their children are. And his skeleton does look remarkably deformed. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So it could be two reasons why this pharaoh looks so different from this pharaoh. And that reason might be that they both look different and they were trying to distance themselves from the religious makeup of Old Kingdom Egypt. Here we have in this sunken relief panel Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti holding their children. And look at these kids. They're the scariest things I've ever seen in my entire life. I say this as a father of two. If my two kids look like this, I think I would leave them on a hospital doorstep. They are terrifying. They have these elongated heads. They look like little aliens. Akhenaten seems to love them, so good for him. But you can see the disfigurement of these bodies, these rounded hips that has. And here we have the sun disk, again, Aton, raining down these symbols of life on both the pharaoh, his wife, and then their three daughters. We see all kinds of representations like this. This is another small statue of Akhenaten. Again, he's got like a little pudgy tire, and he's wearing his headdress with the cobra and the vulture, and he's got the flail, and the crook. This becomes the representation that we commonly see with in the Amarna period, and this is like a great head. I don't know whose head it is, and I only show it because it reminds me of Admiral Akbar from Return of the Jedi, which was the first movie I ever saw in the movie theater. A student a couple years ago, someone found that, and I think that's really funny, but it's probably lost on most 17-year-olds today. If we're going to talk about New Kingdom Egypt, then we have to talk about the one Egyptian ruler you had probably heard of before you began this class, um, and that is King Tut. You might say Cleopatra, but Cleopatra is much more of a Greek than an Egyptian. She's certainly not alive during the classical part of the Egyptian world. She's a contemporary of Julius Caesar. And so in order to sort of get there, we got to talk about my boy Howard Carter. Howard Carter was a Cambridge professor who was an Egyptologist and an archaeologist. And he had a remarkably wealthy benefactor by the name of George Edward Stanhope Moyule Herbert, who was the first Earl of Carnarvon. The more names you have in Great Britain, the more important you are. And Howard Carter was doing excavation work all through the 19 teens and 1920s into what was called the Valley of the Kings. I grew up in Arizona, and in Arizona we have many dry riverbeds that we call arroyos or pantanos, and so this was kind of a dried up riverbed. It had been dried for millennia and millennia, and during the New Kingdom period, the Egyptians buried hundreds of people in the sides of this riverbed, sealed them up, and to be perfectly honest, there were many, many people who had been excavating and looting these for centuries. But the one tomb that they hadn't found yet was that of King Tut. And through the generosity of Lord Carnarvon, Howard Carter had been excavating here, looking for all of that. And if I can find it, I will send along a link for a one of the really fascinating burial structures, which is called KV5. I believe it's the tomb of Ramses V, which goes into the mountainside, and it's like hundreds of rooms deep. It's absolutely amazing. But this was the work that Carter was looking for. He eventually found in 1922, um, in the side of the mountain, quite literally, a series of steps. And he cleared away the rubble of those steps and then found a doorway. And the doorway had on it a seal, and it's kind of hard to imagine the seal, but imagine two doorknobs, right? And around the doorknob was a piece of rope, and that piece of rope had been covered like on the like the ends of it with a kind of clay tablet. So imagine, you have two doorknobs together, you wrap the rope around it, and then you put Play-Doh around the place where the two ends come together. And the fact that the Play-Doh hadn't been broken suggested to Carter that this tomb had been sealed and not disturbed. And the seal on the door had Tutankhamun's name on it. And so he was thrilled. And he sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon, and he wrote, I believe that we found the undisturbed tomb of King Tutankhamun. If you want to come, now is the time. And so Lord Carnarvon, because he had nothing else to do, he was just busy lording, he came to Egypt. And Howard Carter then set to open that door. They opened it up. He stuck in his head with a torch and sat there in silence. And after a while, someone said, Howard, what do you see? And he could only whisper, wonderful things. Howard Carter found the largely undisturbed tomb of King Tut. And in it, in 4 rooms, he found a treasure trove of ancient Egyptian artifacts. And the discovery of this brought on a newfound interest in Egyptian art and architecture that had never before existed. I mean, Howard Carter became a kind of superhero. There were comic books made about him, movies made about him. Um, like the idea of Egyptian art became so common. This was a metal tin in my grandma's house for King Tut brand lemons. I have no idea if King Tut even touched a lemon, but now it became something really, really cool. Before I moved to Ruston and lived in Dubuque, Iowa, there was a jail constructed in 1931. It was Egyptian in architectural design. There were papyrus motifs all over it. All of that is because of King Tut. And so what I wanted to do was talk about all of the important things that King Tutankhamun accomplished. I mean, because this is a really important thing. I mean, King Tut he led a life, and a life filled with, I don't know, breathing and heartbeats and stuff. And so let's talk about all of the things that King Tut did. Are you ready? Because I am. Here we go. Thing number 1, he died. Thing number 2, he managed not to have his tomb looted. That's all. And yes, really. The kid died when he was like 17. Um, One of the things I need to work on is to get images of his skeleton scanned in. I'll show you one. Like, he was a sickly kid. He was club-footed. He couldn't have, my 5-year-old could have beaten him up. Um, he wasn't a great warrior. He wasn't a noble guy. He just died and managed not to have his tomb looted. There's nothing important about what King Tut did, but his tomb survived. Howard Carter began excavating that, and in that he found a remarkable sarcophagus. And in the sarcophagus was another sarcophagus, as in that sarcophagus was another sarcophagus. And in that sarcophagus was another sarcophagus, and in that sarcophagus was the skeleton of King Tut. There he was, undisturbed. And these coffins all sat in one another, kind of like Russian nesting dolls. The outer one was made out of wood, covered with gold and fancy jewels, and this is the innermost sarcophagus. It has 500 pounds of gold. It's covered with lapis lazuli, which you and I now call aquamarine, but during even the Renaissance, lapis lazuli was more valuable ounce per ounce than gold. It's got turquoise, onyx, obsidian, all kinds of random bling. And this is the burial sarcophagus of a pharaoh who died before he finished puberty. Can you imagine what Khafre would have had in his tomb? He has all of the things we would expect of a pharaoh. Hooray! He's got his false beard. I don't know about the 17-year-olds in the room today, but I had like 9 whiskers when I was 17. He has his false beard. He's got the vulture, the symbol of Upper Egypt, the cobra, the symbol of Lower Egypt, this remarkable headdress. And this was the kind of thing that completely lit Egyptologists' lives on fire. It was undisturbed. It was the original burial context. And we had all kinds of stuff from him. We had chariots, we had canoptic jars, we had his seats, we had chairs and thrones, we had his toothbrush. It's like it was like a stick that they used to clean between their teeth. We had pectorals, like kind of like armor. We had all of these things, and it totally rocked Egyptians' worlds. I mean, here is a kind of chest where he's shown riding on front of, looks like a pair of horses with arrows, and he's both hunting and killing the Hyosks, the bad guys who were often invading Egypt from the north. Here's a very similar scene where he's shown hunting an ostrich. So go get him, kid. Go get that ostrich. Here we see a depiction of his wife, and the depiction of him looks similar to that of Akhenaten and Khafre as well. Here, the back and his fancy throne with heads of lions on the cover of it. Here's a walking stick. There were a dozen walking sticks in there. And and when people really began looking at his skeleton, they realized why he had walking sticks. It's because he was club-footed and likely couldn't have walked around without it. So think about what this means for the Egyptians. Like, name a word to describe our Egyptian pharaohs. How about perfect, godlike? And now you have one with a remarkable deformity. There's always been questions as to why King Tut died so young, because he's called the boy king. Why did he die so young? And to be honest, I mean, I'm 44 years old right now, and you know, and if I was alive 2,000 years ago, I'm kind of working up on the end of my lifetime. Modern medicine's an amazing thing. But but most people, if they made it through puberty, they'd make it to what we would now consider middle age. But there's no guarantee that an infant would make it to puberty. But clearly, King Tut had suffered from a variety of medical conditions that we're only now beginning to understand. Here's the outer canoptic container. So inside this sat other canoptic containers. Inside those sat jars with stoppers in them. And in those stoppers remained the mummified remains of King Tut's heart, stomach, liver, and kidneys. And I just think that's really, really cool. We have all kinds of interesting artifacts that survive from King Tut, including what is maybe the coolest artifact of all, and that's his skeleton. It's literally his skeleton. And think about this. These human remains are what, 3,500 years old. And so the guy you're looking at here, he is like the most famous and well-regarded Egyptologist. He's like the national Egyptologist of the country of Egypt. And they performed an MRI on King Tut as a way of trying to figure out sort of what might have been wrong and how he might have died. For example, some people thought he might have had his neck snapped, but as it turns out, there was no sort of cervical fractures um, other than that which might have happened post-mortem. And so there are ways to tell if bones were broken during your life, at which point there are kind of osteoblasts and osteoclasts around the break. But if they happen shortly after your life, those might continue to grow, or if they've been broken when you're pulling a skeleton out of a coffin. And as far as we can tell, he might have died of relatively natural causes without force being applied. They actually created a 3D rendering of what King Tut might have looked like, and I often think that he looks maybe a little bit like Boy George. Now, you are all born in like 2000 and something, and you have no idea who Boy George was. But Boy George was a pop star in the early 1980s, and I kind of only remember him in the most tangential of ways. So, in a lot of ways, when we get to the New Kingdom period, we begin to see different and new things. The representations of rulership absolutely changes, and the ways in which rulers are buried and interred changes as well. This wraps up our discussion of the ancient Egypt world, and we next turn our attention to that of the Greek culture.